Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Employee to Boss podcast. I'm your host, Hayleigh Hayhurst. Now, based off of the title of this episode, you probably know what this is about. So before you stop your podcast, I want you to listen to this episode. I want you to hear what I'm saying and really think about if it's actually time to stop, if it's time to pivot, or if it's just time to take a break. So, with podcasting is so authentic. I have been in this podcast industry for 7 years now, and when you listen to a podcast, you can tell when a host is loving what they're doing, they're loving the topic they're talking about, and they're engaged, and you can tell the difference between a podcast host who is kind of just like over it or really nonchalant about the whole thing. This is something that your audience can really tune into because podcasting is so intimate. It's hard to fake. It's hard to push through when you don't want to push through. And I talk to people all the time who are frustrated with the downloads they're getting on their podcast or lack of downloads, or they don't see their vision anymore, or their strategy isn't working, or they're not getting sponsorships, or all of these things. And so I want to dive into a few things to think about that may change your opinion on this. So number one, I will start this off by saying this. I say this time and time again. I'll say this till I'm blue in the face. If you're starting your podcast to make money, you are going to burn out because while, yes, you can make money from your podcast, it's definitely not immediate. Unless you have like a strong social media following already, or a strong email list, or just an audience in general. People who have an audience previously definitely can get sponsorships right off the bat. But for business coaches who are just starting out, or social media strategists who are freelancing, or any business owner who is like building up their name and their credibility, you are probably not going to get sponsors right off the bat. So that's why I always say you need to have a deeper reason to start your podcast than just making money. But one of the biggest reasons for starting a podcast is what I just said, building up your name. So although you might not get money right off the bat, you're getting credibility. Your podcast is working for you. At least it should be. When I work with my clients, that's what I make sure happens. I make sure that their podcast is actually working for them, that they're not having to put in too much work, and it's really just like fun and free and building up their credibility. So visibility into your business is huge. And this is what I really coach people on. You can absolutely, put up blog posts, put up social media posts, put up a website. And while those are great, a podcast is just so much more intimate. This is why people can tell if you're faking it or not, right? It's so intimate. People can listen to you and really understand what your business is about, what you're about. They can decide if they want to work with you. They can decide if maybe you have the same values as them. Depending on what industry you're coaching in or what topic you're talking about in your business, a podcast is an unbelievably amazing resource for you to really tap into. I think that podcasting is while yes, there are a ton of podcasts, and I always see the jokes online about like everyone and their mom has a podcast now. Yes, while that may be true, there's so much potential in podcasting, especially for business. And so I don't want you to get, strayed away from it because you think everyone has a podcast. Not everyone has a podcast. A podcast is a lot of work, which may be why you're at this moment of, should I keep going? Is this worth it? It is a lot of work, but it is worth it once you put a strategy to it. And that brings me to my second point. A lot of people lose the vision that they had in the beginning for their podcast, or they didn't set up a vision in the first place. So when I first start coaching any clients, we talk about your long-term goals and your short-term goals, because this helps me understand more about you, more about where you want your podcast to go, and more about like your ambition level, but also like the results that you want to see. So what I mean by ambition level and the results that you want to see is the strategy that I would create for someone who wants to book 3 new clients a month from their podcast is going to be different than a person who wants to book 1 client a quarter from their podcast. And it's going to be very different from someone who maybe wants to create a talk show from their podcast. And that's going to be different from someone who wants to, one day be picked up by a major podcast source, like, just off the top of my head, Spotify. Like, if you want to be a Spotify exclusive podcast, then that strategy is going to be different from someone who wants to just get 1 client a quarter from your podcast. If you are following what I'm saying, like, you need to see your long-term vision, and I think this is what a lot of people miss in the podcast creation part. They get so wrapped up in, oh, what am I going to name it? Who is going to be my listener? What am I going to talk about? Who am I going to interview? They forget that, like, they're starting their podcast for a reason. And if you don't have that reason set, it's going to be hard to keep up with it. And so that's maybe why you're at this crossroad of to keep going or to stop. Now, some other objections that I hear a lot about are you've run out of things to say, maybe, which at this point I would urge you to maybe pivot your podcast. This is an example of a very successful podcast, but that got a lot of slack in the beginning, and even now today, the reputation isn't amazing, but the podcast and what it's achieved is amazing. So I'm sure a lot of us have heard about the podcast Call Her Daddy. Alex Cooper is the host. When it first started off, she had a co-host. The show was very raunchy, it was a lot. It was really a lot. But that's what made it so popular, right? Like, people listened to it because they were like, it's these 2 girls talking about sex, this topic that so many people avoid talking about, and they're really just open about it. And so it brought in a lot of listeners, and then it was picked up by Barstool Sports, and then they had this drama that happened, and Alex Cooper is the sole podcast host now, and it has kind of shifted to like almost a mental health podcast. It's very healthy now. She interviews psychologists and, celebrities and all of these things, and it's not so raunchy anymore, but it's completely transitioned. So she has pivoted this podcast, and I saw on Instagram she just got engaged, and you may be like, Hayleigh, I don't care about this podcast or this girl. Why are you telling me this story? I'm telling you this story because of the meaning behind this all, which is her podcast pivoted with her. So as she became the solo host, she knew she couldn't keep up like that comedy back and forth with her co-host because she was no longer there. And so she really transitioned it to what she was more interested in and what she thought that the audience would be more interested in, which was, talking about relationships and sex from like a healthier standpoint. And even in her Instagram post of her getting engaged, she was like, there's a time where this would have been very off-brand for me, but I'm so glad myself and the podcast have grown together. So the whole reason I'm telling you this is if you've run out of things to say, it's probably because you've grown as a person, or maybe your business has grown, and it's time to really rethink, does your podcast fit into that major goal that you have? I'm sure if you have a business, you have a goal for your business So transition your podcast to match that. That could be as simple as starting a new season and being like, hey everyone, welcome to season 2 of the podcast. We're really turning a page here and talking about blah, blah, blah. Some new topic. Make sure that, your marketing goes along with it, but I think that would be a better shift than stopping your podcast altogether. Another objection that I hear about is, I don't have time to keep doing my podcast. It's not getting the results that I want or the listeners that I want, the amount of listeners, and so it's just not worth my time. So while yes, it should be enjoyable that you're doing your show and it should work with your schedule, probably the reason it's not getting the listenership that you're wanting or the growth that you're wanting to see is because you're not dedicating that time to it to actually grow it. And maybe this is because you just don't have time in general for your podcast. So if you are a business owner and you want to attract some clients from your podcast, I would highly urge you to reach out to me or just a podcast producer in general and see if that's worth your time. Because if you're putting time into your podcast, you're basically spending money on it because time is money. Your time is expensive, right? So you're already doing that. It might be worth it to outsource maybe the editing or the content graphic creation, the graphic design part, the marketing assets. It might be worth it to outsource those, and so you can spend time on the parts that you actually want to spend time on. One of my clients that I work with, she was editing her podcast, and it was like she was doing a great job at it. She was making the time. But she got to a point where she wanted to really grow it. She wanted to start doing TikTok and really focusing on content, graphic creation, social media creation, reels. She wanted to create all of these things that would make this podcast huge. And so she realized that the, 5 hours, 10 hours a month that she was spending on her podcast editing, she could just outsource that and spend that 10 hours a month onto her marketing. And her TikTok took off, her Instagram is growing, and really the traction is there, and she's getting so many more downloads because she's outsourcing the part that's taking up time. Like I said, time is money. She's putting her time into something that will make her money by growing the podcast, and it's basically making what I do, almost free to her because she's making money from what she's doing because she was able to outsource to me. So just something to keep in mind. The way we think about outsourcing is kind of like, oh, I can do this myself, or I've been doing this myself. Why would I pay someone? It's because your time is precious, and if you're frustrated with it, your audience is going to be able to tell, and you will not be able to see the results that you're wanting to see. Another thing that I see a lot of people complain about is, I'm not getting the listeners that I want. And that goes back into what I just said. You're probably not getting the listeners that you want because you're not promoting it. Every single episode that you publish should be promoted. Every single episode. Because don't you want those eyes on your podcast? It may seem like a lot of work, but if the reason you want to start your podcast is because you're not getting those listeners, you're going to need to put in that work. And so that is just my piece of advice there. My final piece of advice is, if you're not excited about your podcast, if you genuinely do not enjoy recording or interviewing or doing things to keep your podcast pushing forward, then you might be burnt out and you might just need a break. You might just need to take a month off. You might need to take a couple months off. Take your time to get back to it. And I would say if after a month you're not like, okay, I'm ready to go back, maybe it is time to take a break from your podcast. And if you're okay with that, then that might be what's best for you. I know podcast producers are always like, don't quit your podcast. But there are times where, you know, you don't want to burn yourself out if it's not bringing you any benefit. If you've like actually tried, if you've like really, really tried and you're not seeing the results that you want, and maybe you don't have the money to hire a podcast coach like I am, then yeah, take a break. And if you are loving that break, maybe it's just time to stop. But I would really encourage you, if you are just like lost in your podcast journey, or if you are just feeling uninspired or feeling confused or feeling like you want to come up with a bigger mission, but like you're really struggling with the creation part of that, I would highly recommend that you honestly just book a call with me and we can walk through like what the issue is that you're experiencing, how I would fix it. And I've been, like I said, in this industry for 7 years. I have been in my business, Espresso Podcast Production, full-time for 3 years. I've worked with hundreds of podcasters, hundreds. Some of them are brand new and they're super excited. Some of them are like middle of the line, like 50, 60 episodes in, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to ramp this up. Like, I'm ready. I've been doing this for a year. I'm really ready to like make money and keep going. And then I also talk to some people who are like, Hayleigh, like, I honestly don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I think I'm ready to stop. And so I can guarantee you there's no problem that you can come to me with that I have not talked to someone about before. So you will be in good hands by booking a call with me. You can book it on my website, or you can go to calendly.com/Hayleigh Hayhurst. That'll pull up my calendars. And so I will put the link in the show notes. But I think that's a great opportunity to figure out what's going on firsthand, and we'll get to the bottom of it. When I get into these strategy calls, I come prepared. I come with advice. I come with researching not just your podcast, but also your business. So I'll see like if I see a disconnect, or if I see an issue somewhere, or like what I'll do is I'll walk you through my espresso growth strategy and really like pinpoint some key areas to work on and things like that. And so it is very worth it, and you will walk away with valuable advice. So if you're kind of at the crossroad of like, should I do it, should I not? Book a strategy call with me and we will figure out what is going on. So I hope that this is helpful. I talked about a wide range. Of course, ideally, I don't want you to stop your podcast because there's so many benefits to podcasting. But if you're really like at your wit's end, I get it. But let's chat either way. I'm here to help. If you're interested in getting some podcast coaching, definitely go on my website, espressopodcastproduction.com, or you can come connect with me on Instagram. That's where I hang out the most. Espresso Podcast Production is where you'll find me. So I will talk to you soon with another interview episode. Talk to you later. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Employee to Boss podcast. If you made it to the end of this episode, I hope that you implement the actionable steps from this week's experts so you can get started with your business today. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the Employee to Boss podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps more than you could ever imagine. Remember, a little progress each day leads to big results. We come out with a new episode every Tuesday. To access our show notes, transcripts, and courses, please check out espressopodcastproduction.com.